colleagues with me. I have Bernard Martin, who is a steam, as you can see, a steam aficionado. And we have Mark, you know, I forgot your last name.
Curtis.
Mark Curtis. Anyway, Mark Curtis. Mark is a very accomplished steampunk cosplayer. He specializes in weapons and all sort of other contraptions that you see in steampunk. I actually met him at a NACRCon a few years ago. If you're not familiar with a NACRCon is a steampunk convention. They call it an alternate history convention, but it's basically steampunk.
It's really just a steampunk convention.
Yep.
Marketing.
So I'll start off with kind of talking a little bit about how steampunk came to be, and then we'll get into the conversation. A few years ago, about 2010, I'm a part of a group called the State of Black Science Fiction. And basically it's a collection of creators, writers, and enthusiasts of speculative fiction from an African/African American perspective. And we were having a conversation one day, and the subject of steampunk came up. And in the conversation, people were basically saying, you know, steampunk is okay, but I don't really see a lot of black people in steampunk. But specifically, I don't see a lot of stories in steampunk that include the African/African American experience from that time period. And those of you, I'm assuming everybody here is familiar with steampunk, so I don't have to explain what steampunk is.
Actually, I'm vaguely familiar. Can you do like just a small sound? Yes.
Well, you know what? I'm gonna let Mark and Bernard explain to you what steampunk is.
What you initially hear is it's Victorian science fiction from a modern perspective. Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, what if they had had cell phones and cars and satellites and everything? And then the other one you hear is painted brass and slap some gears on it.
Which actually is not a bad description. Really not. It's shocking, actually. I'm going to jump in here. Steampunk is one of those interesting things that evolved. The summary, the shortest way to say it is steampunk is a visual aesthetic. It is something that looks a certain way, which is why you can slap a gear on it, put a cog here, do that thing, make it paint it brown, it looks good, call it steampunk. Throw some goggles on it, y'all. So that's the original aesthetic. And then they realized that there was an existing literary convention that also was steampunk. And this was K.W. Jeter with a book called Morlock Night. And it was if you remember the Time Machine, the Time Machine is a fantastical creation. It's obviously advanced science. And it was in Victorian England. And they never explained it. I'm a writer, throw it on my shoulder, keep going. So people said, well, if they can do it then, let's do the same thing now. So it's 2007. We never found oil. How are you getting energy? Steam. And by the way, 90% of electricity made is still not with steam. We don't talk about it, but it's true. You have a big tube of water pushing a turbine, which turns it in, and it makes it, and they boil water somewhere and it makes steam, and you get that. So we're burning coal to make steam, to make electricity still. So it's not very far-fetched. So they take this and they go, throw away the stuff that makes things complicated in science fiction, like, you know, star travel and all that kind of stuff, bring it back down to very terrestrial origins, and make the story about the people, not the technology. If you reduce the technology, it has to be about the people, and that's steampunk. Very simple. But like every other story on the planet, it's very simple, but there are no people of color. So when he says steampunk,
and this goes back to where we came in. Like Vernard said, they didn't see a lot of black people in steampunk. And when you saw black people in steampunk, everybody else was different but us.
It was the head nod.
Yeah.
That's actually how I met Vernard. Honest to God. I'm dressed in steampunk. Vernard was dressed in steampunk. Teresa and I were walking somewhere, and Vernard and I did the.
Yep. And that's an international thing, of course, my nephew. So we were like, we felt like, you know, people really weren't being imaginative about our experiences and our history during that time period. You know, I think, what's the name, the book that was written about the people in Seattle, Cherise Priest's book.
Mhm.
The Steampunk Century series.
Yeah.
The big one was called Bone Shakers. The
Yeah,
first one.
I read Bone Shaker, and I started reading because I wasn't into steampunk. I was into alternate history, but people
Right.
were telling me that I was into steampunk, and I'm in alternate history. So I started reading some steampunk books, and I started reading it. And of course, being black, I'm looking at where the black people are, and it's like, okay, in every case scenario where there's a black person, if you're dealing with African Americans, we're still slaves. We're just slaves longer. You know, the Civil War's been going on for 20 years now, so the black folks are still slaves. You know, and I'm like, and I kept seeing this over and over again. So, me being the person that I am, a lot of the anthologies that I've done have been based on the fact that it was something that we saw there was a need for. So I said, let's not talk about it, let's do something about it. So I said, hey, all of us are writers, I'm a publisher, send me some stories in that you think would be considered African American based steampunk, and I'll pick the best ones and we'll publish it. And so we wanted to give it a name because we like to do that. We have Sword and Soul. We want to be able to give people a name. That's from the marketing standpoint, so people will know when they see this particular book what they get. So we said, what should we call it? You know, and at the time we didn't know that other people were already using this word for different things. But there's a brother named Maurice Broaddus who had written a steampunk story that had been published. The name of the story was Pimp My Airship. And he said, well, you know, I call what I write steampunk. And so we said, cool, we'll call the anthology Steamfunk. So everybody sent their stories in, and we were really, really relieved when we got the stories in because we thought we were gonna get a bunch of stories about like blaxploitation, like pimps and steam cars and all that kind of stuff like that. And we're like, please don't get, but the writers, to me, they outperformed themselves. They sent us exactly what we were looking for. So we compiled them all together. We made the anthology. For those of you who are not familiar with it, this is the anthology, Steamfunk.
Highly recommended.
The cover artist freaked us out because when he came back with this collage of images and we looked at it, we were like, man, you know, that's kind of pretty, but nobody's going to like that for a book cover. So we tested it out, and everybody loved it, so we went with that. We actually introduced the book at an APRICON. We planned it because we were going to be at an APRICON. Balogun Ojitade, who is not here right now, who's one of the co-editors of the book, he actually did a panel introducing the book. When I first got there, I just had it sitting on my table, and then Balogun had his panel, and then right after the panel, people started coming over to the table saying, "Man, give me some of that funk," you know. So we sold a bunch of copies of the book, and the fast way to explain the book is that. There are stories in here where the main characters happen to be black. There are stories in here where the main characters have to be black. I think it's also a good reference for steampunk because it also shows steampunk in all its different aspects. You have some of the writers who have basically concentrate on that 19th century type aesthetic in the world, this world, and there's some people that have taken the aesthetic and put it on different planets or total fantastic scenarios, and the writers don't mince words and they don't hesitate to go there. You know, there are some stories that deal with slavery, you know, deal with racism and everything, because that's, you know, they're writing from the heart. So, the result of it was very interesting, as these gentlemen can attest. There were people who loved it and said, "Hey, this is what I've been waiting to see in steampunk. I've been waiting to see something like this." There were people who said, "What are you guys doing? Steampunk was fine the way it is. You're separating us. You know, you're dividing the genre because now, you know, you people always say you want to be a part of something. Now here you go do something on your own and separate yourself and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, how dare you do what you want to do?" Basically, and stuff. So, for a moment, it got a little ugly. But what happened was that overall, the steampunk community accepted the book. And for every person that came out and said it was an issue, there were probably about 5 or 6 people that came out and said, "This is great. You know, I love it. Let's have some more," that kind of thing. So that being the introduction of the book, steampunk led to us taking a look at other parts of this genre and looking at how we saw black people being represented. The thing Dieselfunk came up, and if you're not familiar with Dieselfunk, it's similar to steampunk except for everything takes place in that 1930s, 40s type aesthetic. A lot of World War II type images and that kind of thing like that. And then there's, you guys learn about all these new genres today. Then there's Rococo. Rococo is basically, again, something similar to steampunk, but it takes place in a 17th century perspective. You know, like pirates, swashbucklers. It's based on the word Rococo, which was a style of architecture that was very popular in France, I believe, during that time.
Came after Baroque.
And it's spelled R-O-C-O-C-O.
Right.
But us being who we are, we put an A on the end of it, so it's Rococo. You know, so again, you know, distinguishing that aesthetic and stuff. And this one just recently came out, and it's a really good book. It's a fun book. You can take a look at it. A lot of pirate stories in there. Apparently, everybody wants to be a pirate these days, so even my story was a pirate story. But let's talk about that, and let me get away from the explanation. And the reason I want to talk to Vernard and Mark was because they've been involved in steampunk a lot longer than I have. And I guess my first question is, from your standpoint, how did you see the steampunk genre or aesthetics prior to steampunk? And do you think that steampunk has had, or this whole aspect of taking a look at these genres from a different perspective, has it had an effect on the genres as a whole?
I think, no, without a doubt, it has had an effect. He's been there, and I've been there from the beginning. You see, the steampunk thing came off like gangbusters when it went mainstream, so to speak. When everybody was doing all the things, courses for women, guys are wearing great outfits, people are putting together gadgets and gizmos. But from the perspective of a black guy, it looked like England.
Well, it was from everybody.
I mean, I know, but definitely.
But yeah.
But there's no connection to England for me, zero.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're American, you might have some vague concept of the Brits in that world and saying I have a connection to it, but it was zero connection to it for me. So what this let me do, when I saw this, is I saw a distinct connection. And with that distinct connection, I go, I now can appreciate the other stuff more because I have a connection through here. So for me, steampunk was like, wow, there is another point of view. And now everybody's point of view is valid for a change, and not just the people who want to take this very narrow lens, who want to broaden that lens. And it was amazing. Some of the outfits that he made, people were just jaw-dropping. I never would have thought that way because you had this really set a nice lens here, and he said, let's make it bigger. Now all of a sudden you're getting more creative. So it got a new kick to the creativity.
Yeah,
steampunk.
And steampunk also, when steampunk had started to wane, it was it was on the way down, and here come Milton and D, and they brought there was more excitement back to the genre. And now, steampunk now it's leveled out. It was up here, now it's down here, but it would have died out much sooner if it wasn't for steampunk.
If not completely, because things spike hard, just like a rocket. They go up there and then it falls.
Rococo is pretty recent, and Rococo, Balagoon was one of the major forces behind Rococo. Because again, we're talking about our history during the 16th, 17th century. We think about, okay, this was the time when the transatlantic trade started, and all this stuff was going bad. But you have to realize during this time period, there were still powerful African kingdoms. And that, it was only until the late 1890s before these kingdoms became colonies. During that time period, the British had to negotiate with these folks. A perfect example is in Angola. The Angolans had diplomats. They used to go visit the king in Portugal. And they had to negotiate with these people. They weren't just running up in here doing things. They had to sign treaties, and they had to do what they were told to do. And when they didn't do it, they got ran out of there. Exactly. One of the interesting things that I saw about it, and I said, is actually going to put it in one of my stories, is that the Angolans were very good with throwing clubs, and they were so deadly with them that people would rather get shot than to get hit with a throwing club.
About Fredonia, which I personally love this whole concept. Are you going to do anything? Are you going to open it up to other authors? This world that you created that is so freaking rich, it's ridiculous.
There is plans to have a Fredonia anthology.
Yes, please.
Because like you said, when we first wrote out the ideal, people were like, and the beautiful thing about it, it wasn't just black people.
I love
It was everybody looking at this whole new arrangement of North America, and all these ideals started coming.
Yeah,
in.
you get it.
You know,
The first time I saw the map,
Yeah, the map.
I
thought
stared.
you don't have maps here.
I stared at the map for 30 minutes, and B had to take it from me. Balgoon had to, because I was just, he needed it for something, and I was, no.
Because we actually tried to think about how it would change the whole makeup of North America. Because this is something that would have happened in the early 1800s, which means that the Trail of Tears with the Cherokees and stuff would have never happened. You know, Native Americans from the south of the United States would have never been relocated. Americans would not have had the power to fulfill the manifest destiny.
The West didn't do the West.
Exactly. So the West actually remained under control of Spanish influences and stuff. The Native Americans in this scenario basically consolidated and formed their own region that they just called the nations. It was still a loose confederation, but they would come together whenever somebody tried to come in their area. So that just kind of changed the whole dynamics of what's happening in the United States, how the North America is relating to the rest of the world. You know.
She's got a good question.
Okay.
I want to quickly state on that. One of the things you notice in the pure steampunk world is there is no nation building. The world stayed effectively the same. They take a point in history and they start writing from that. They say, okay, the Civil War didn't end, but nothing changed. They don't do world building. They just tell a story and they're isolated. Even the people who told the best stories, like it says, the Cherie, she's an amazing writer. We all give her props. Her story was probably one of the best steampunk stories that ever came out of the whole set.
Yeah.
She didn't even change much. She just stays in Oregon where she lives and writes stories about it. Seriously, she wrote stories about that. But with the whole concept of steampunk, you had to take a holistic approach to what story you're telling.
Because
you can't.
and without a widening of world building, all we get is you're a slave. If you stay in America, if you go to Africa, all you get is y'all are just living in huts or whatever. You have to you have to change it up to get the stories that are coming out of Steamfunk.
They raised that level. To write the stories of the Afro people, they had to raise their game, had to raise the quality, and then when everybody else realized what they got out of that, everybody else wants to get in on it. Except for the traditional steampunk, who are more than happy to keep writing these same stories over and over, and that's why they're down here now.
And that's, to me, that's why I like the historical, what Fredonia did. Because when you go to read alternative or historical fiction, right? Anytime you type in Google or whatever, black historical fiction, you're going to get two things. You can get a lot of stuff about Bass Reeves.
Yeah.
A lot of stuff about him, and you can get a lot of stuff about slaves.
Yeah.
And that's it. Like, there is no other situation. So the thing that